there's a way in which I think the directness that Katie had spoke to requires a certain responsibility towards where does suffering actually start and where does it end. And it's easy to think that it has started somewhere else and it ends somewhere else. And I feel like the invitation that you're making and that she's making is to say, no, it starts and ends with us. And no matter how wonderful and beautiful and perfect whatever leader we imagine could be, the suffering stops and ends with us.
It also doesn't mean that you don't act. Right. It's not the dualism of active, passive. It's non-dual. Wisdom, non-dual. But it does not mean that you don't act when it's time to act. And the same way as it doesn't mean that you don't sleep just because you're a fan of wakefulness. There are times when it's really not wise to stay awake. We need our sleep.
Yeah.
Okay? But when we're awake, you can ask yourself, actually, how awake are we? Or are we in the narrative of how awake we are and what great meditators we are and how great Byron Katie is, and just light years away from what's being pointed to. So this is in some sense where the rubber meets the road for us, and I'm in complete alignment with you, Soren, that if it was you that said it, but that, what's unfolding is perfect. Why? Because it's unfolding. And that it's, in some sense, had it unfolded differently, we could have stayed asleep to a certain kind of dis-ease that now it's almost impossible to stay asleep to, and that brings up perhaps a lot of fear, and in some communities a lot more fear than others because it's more proximal. But if you're a feeling, sensing, breathing person with compassion and empathy, then we're feeling that fear, that pain. And, in the work that we teach, called MBSR, we teach people to turn towards all of the unwanted stuff that's in your life. Why? Because it's already here. And to approach it with kind of welcome mat and curiosity and an inquiry too, a deep inquiry is like, am I my pain? Am I my fear? Am I my suffering? And I don't mean like, ask yourself and then think about it. I mean direct penetrating into awareness and apprehending whether in this moment, no matter how much pain or fear or anxiety you're in, whether that is the full story of who you are or who's meditating. And one of the beauties of this work over the past almost 40 years, just to talk about MBSR, is that we don't ask people their political persuasion when they come in with back pain or cancer or heart disease or any chronic anything. We just assume, another full-blown miraculous being has come into the room. And we don't look at the diagnosis either. Everybody comes with a diagnosis. As a rule, we don't look at the diagnosis because we want to meet the human being. How many of you use hospitals ever? Dangerous, but sometimes necessary. Raise your hands up high, I want to feel that. How many of you go to the hospital sometimes? Okay. So now it's all electronic medical records, but every time you walk in the door, they need to know you've walked in the door because they need to charge you. And that's called an encounter form. But we've noticed over the years that the business of medicine is into the encounter forms more than it's into the encounter. If you're not careful, you could go through a whole visit to the hospital or stay in the hospital and never be met, never be encountered in an open-hearted spaciousness of not knowing and beyond the diagnosis or the treatment, like a human being in the bed or in the chair. And when you turn that around, when you exercise or, catalyze an orthogonal rotation in consciousness, same hospital, same patients, same doctors, same everything, only everything's different because we've got mindfulness. And so we can see, feel, hear the actual lattice structure of being, and we have an infinite number of degrees of freedom of how we are going to be in relationship to what we don't like, feeling, say, disregarded.
Right.
You know?
I think that level of attunement allows us to feel into what the response that needs to come through in that moment versus the repetitive.
And then you don't need to be wounded about it. Because when you're honest, you just like take care of it. In that moment, it evaporates, and then you just reel with, but you don't take it personally. So this is one of the most powerful elements of any kind of mindfulness practice, is to recognize how easy it is to take personally that which is not personal, whether it's Trump or whether it's, our fears of what's going to happen or anything. These are narratives that may be true to a degree, but to a lot, it's like this whole thing about false news is very interesting because, there's a lot of dissimulation, propaganda, and it's always happened in dystopic times and in, pre-fascist times and everything else. I mean, Goebbels has a great quote about, just keep telling the lies long enough and big enough and find a scapegoat, and everybody will, be happy. But at the same time, if we can apprehend that, then we can also see that a lot of the stories we tell ourselves are false news. And you asked Katie, what's new? You did ask Katie.
What is real news?
Real news. And there's a line from a Wallace Stevens poem, which is in Coming to Our Senses. I don't remember the whole poem, but the last line is, and it's all about bombs falling on cities and everything else. I mean, it's like a real poem of pain and desolation, destruction, and blackout. And the last line is, the real news is there's no news at all. No news at all. So when we, sort of face the challenges of this era, if we're not taking this sort of orthogonal wisdom perspective, then we're going to get caught constantly and blame it on the other without recognizing that it's a kind of, we're participating in a certain kind of game or unfolding where a lot of the news is questionable. A lot of the facts are actually questionable. I mean, if you ask me a lot of facts about American history, I have my own view of American history, but I don't know that much about it, I'm sorry to say. But a lot of the time when we think about American history, we fashion it so that it's our story of the American history. It's like based on our facts, or our forgetfulness or whatever it is.
Or one segment of the population story.
Yeah, exactly. Like not interested in, slavery. That's so, can't we get over slavery? No. Because we've never done the healing. Jack Kornfield, I think, said, truth and reconciliation around the legacy of slavery is non-trivial. What about the Native American genocide? Thing. So we can point our fingers at the Palestinians and the, everywhere in the world where, if only they had what we had, they would be so enlightened. Look at us. So there's a certain dis-ease of the body politic, and I think Katie's absolutely right. If we're not willing to align ourselves with what's deepest and best and most beautiful in us on a virtually moment-by-moment and everyday basis, then the prognosis is that we're going to just get more of the same. And there'll be an enormous amount of harm, potentially. We need you said, third way, or an alternative way of dealing with this. And I think, people in this room, I have an enormous amount of optimism and faith. And not just this room, but the sort of online world and all the other worlds that intersect with this, that, this is our curriculum for the moment. This is our curriculum. What does it mean to be human in this kind of a time, and to lead with our humanity as opposed to leading with our fear without denying the fear?